Hello and welcome to another episode of All for All on the Democracy at Work channel. I'm the person who talks on these episodes. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and you can find more of my work at zerohourreport.com. I've solicited suggestions about different things we might talk about on this program, which I have said, the basic theme is that our social imaginations need to catch up with our technological imaginations, and hopefully they'll start to evolve together. But I've been asked, among those suggestions, to talk about my time working with Bernie Sanders on the 2016 campaign. So I haven't really done that at any length. So, okay, I will do that. I thought about writing a book after the campaign, but for reasons that are probably a little too complicated to go into, I didn't really have it in me. But I was an early member of that 2016 campaign. Bernie's chief of staff first contacted me about a budget committee role on January 1st, 2015, but I moved too slowly. I thought about it for 24 hours, and I think in the meantime, he got somebody else. But a couple months later, in fact, I'll check my notes. I think it was sometime in March or April, I got a call from Bernie himself. He had come to town to speak at a conference organized by Marianne Williamson, who I'm friends with, and he was with Marianne at some sort of kickoff reception for it, and said he had been looking for me. And she said, well, she had my number. So Marianne called me and handed me over to Bernie. And for me, at least, the rest is history. He said he asked me to meet him the next morning for breakfast, which I did. And he asked me the question, if he ran for president, would I come work for him? And I said I would. I didn't wait 24 hours. Then at Marianne's conference, in front of a packed crowd, he asked the crowd whether they would support him if he ran for president. Again, this was pretty early in 2015, and they all raised their hands and I believe stood up. Virtually everybody in the room. I didn't see anyone who didn't, which was a huge sign of what was to come. Now we know, and I know personally, that if Elizabeth Warren had chosen to run in 2016, Bernie would not have. But he did, as he told me. Well, let me kind of tell the story in sequence. First of all, he called me his writer and chief editor, although speechwriter was part of the job. He was reluctant to call it that, and I'll get to that in a second. Now, writing for Bernie Sanders might seem like the loneliest job in town, to quote an old TV commercial, because Bernie is known for speaking his own mind and writing his own words. But I found a way to make that role work. And I have to say, I learned a lot over the 65 weeks of that campaign. And as I'll go through here, the most important thing I learned was that, of course, as we've all learned, politics doesn't have to be as superficial, as advertising driven, or as celebrity conscious as it has been for the last century. In fact, if anything, it was a shortcoming that the campaign moved so much in that direction. We'll never know for sure. I do still believe that we can overthrow the old economic and political order and the dictatorship of the soundbite at the same time. But to get there, we'll have to change the entertainment-driven nature of politics itself. So I got that phone call on New Year's Eve day. Then when Bernie asked me to meet him for breakfast a few weeks later in Los Angeles, where I was then living, he asked that question. Shortly afterwards, another opportunity came up with the Senate Budget Committee, where Bernie was, I guess at the time, minority. I guess Democrats were in the minority. Honestly, I can't recall. But when I arrived in Washington to discuss that job, he took me aside, this classic Bernie, for a long one-on-one talk. And about that job, he said, they were not authorized to offer you that, which is odd. He told me he was planning to run for president and asked me to join that campaign instead. I think I was maybe employee number 5. He had other people working for him, of course, a number of them, but as a full-time campaign employee, I was definitely early. He told me in that campaign, he said, this is not about winning a primary contest. It's about raising the issues nobody's talking about. And that's how everybody understood Bernie's campaign, as a message campaign. In fact, he said, let's be honest, it is highly unlikely I will ever occupy the Oval Office. It's true that he didn't, but neither one of us had any idea how close he was going to come. I had an inkling, though. There was something about it that I'd been writing for years about how there was an untapped and unnamed economic populist movement in this country. You could see it in the polls. You could see it in the fact that 70% of the population or so wanted to expand Social Security, that a majority wanted the government to ensure health care, that Democrats didn't like talking about poverty, but people believed the government should do more to eliminate poverty, on and on and on, and issue after issue on the economic front. It was clear to me and obviously to Bernie that there was an untapped sentiment. So while I thought it was a hell of a long shot to think of Bernie as president, I didn't think of it as impossible by any means. Now, my friends in the Washington world kind of laughed at me and said, well, okay, the campaign starts in April. You'll need a new job by September. Obviously, that wasn't the case. But then again, even for well-intentioned political insiders, Bernie's reputation was pretty well fixed in Washington, D.C. For those folks, he was a fringe figure. He was somebody whose politics had brought him into the Senate in the small state of Vermont, but he was somebody they could ignore. For progressive groups looking for a political advocate, he was the guy they could always go to if they couldn't get somebody more famous to endorse a bill or an idea that they were promoting. So he was trustworthy, not spectacular, but he could be counted on to show up for a cause when nobody else would. So people like me really appreciated him and respected him. People like them really appreciated him and respected him. But for the political culture of Washington, D.C., he was disliked. He was actively disliked, something that never really went away. And there was something else about politics in DC at the time. Everybody in politics, from the left to the right, thought that they knew how politics works. The American people wanted one set of policies, and the political and business and media elites wanted another. So the elites were always going to get their way. There were studies showing that. A famous research study from Princeton showed that elites almost always get their way. The majority occasionally gets its way, but that's usually, in fact, almost always, because what they want and what the elites want are the same. So that was the way it is. That's a system in which progressives in the political sphere felt they needed to work, including me in many ways at many times. But out there in the darkness, as they say in science fiction movies, something was moving. Something was going to challenge what it's hard to remember now what America was like in the mid 2010s. There was something I called the bipartisan consensus, with the meaning, in my case, everybody called it that, but I said bipartisan means you could buy members of both parties, because polls show that the American people supported things that the political world said were extreme, like universal health care, like expanded Social Security. So, for example, in one poll, 3/4 of Tea Party members, if you're a member of the Tea Party, said that they don't want to see Social Security benefits cut to balance the budget, which was then a policy actively supported and being pursued by the leaders of both major political parties. In fact, in a 2012 debate, Barack Obama said he and Mitt Romney had the same plans and thoughts about Social Security, which was to cut benefits in multiple ways in order to, quote unquote, balance the budget. So the polls at that point confirmed that nobody was speaking for the people. But by 2010, the Republican Party was already maybe on the first one or two stops of its trip on the crazy train. It was on its way to becoming a kind of Star Wars bar for every motley character in the political galaxy, racists, corporatists, nihilists, all welcome in the corrupt bacchanalia of the GOP, which suited the party's billionaire backers just fine. The crazies brought their votes and then reliably voted to cut taxes on corporations and the wealthy. Of course, we know now that the so-called Freedom Caucus came to dominate the party with extremist far-right positions that would only be replaced by even more extreme positions of the MAGA crowd. Now, I've talked before about what the Democrats did as a formula, the one they implemented under Bill Clinton to become a more moderate form of corporate austerity advocates than the Republicans, kindler, gentler slashings of the social contract and dismantling of social welfare programs. Their plan was to to mask what was really an economic conservatism, a political conservatism, an economic philosophy that fell, for example, to the right of Republican presidents like Dwight Eisenhower or Richard Nixon by embracing a kind of watered down and timid form of social liberalism, identity politics, which, while continuing to employ here and there certain bigoted tropes where they might prove tactically useful, as in, for example, Bill Clinton's recommendation to John F. Kerry in 2004 that he embrace the Republican proposal for a bill that would define marriage as a union between a man and a woman. So things began to shift, as we say, in that second decade. One big turning point, perhaps more so than we realized at the time, the unexpected popularity of Occupy Wall Street shifted everybody's rhetoric in the political world. Even Mitt Romney started to acknowledge the 99%. Barack Obama had to, at least rhetorically, shift dramatically from what had been his rightward tack, and he adopted a newly populist tone early on in his 2012 campaign, which shifted the numbers in his favor, and he got reelected. The election of Senator Elizabeth Warren and her subsequent popularity nationwide also suggested there was an unmet need for leaders who would at least speak on behalf of the 99%. Now, we all believe that a deal had to be made to placate the Clinton machine in 2008 after Hillary Clinton's loss to Obama in the primaries. And as a result, Clinton operatives were given plum positions in the Obama administration, and through a combination of deal making and intimidations, the Clintons would ensure, because they still had such iron fisted control over so much of the party machinery, they ensured that nobody in Democratic politics would dare challenge Hillary for the presidential nomination in 2016. A movement arose to encourage Hillary Clinton to run in the primaries, but she decided not to. So it was considered a sure thing that centrist Democratic ideas, so-called, even though they're to the right of the public opinion, would once again dominate the party in 2016. Enter Bernie Sanders. Now, if Bernie had won, I would have called my book about it The Unselling of the President 2016, because Bernie did not sell his campaign in the usual way. But Bernie's character was important for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was what it told us about the changing nature of politics. Remember, presidential politics had been transformed by the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. That transformation was completed in 1968 with the advertisement-driven campaign, successful, of Richard Nixon. That campaign was memorialized in a book entitled The Selling of the President, 1968. To a greater or lesser extent, every presidential campaign since the 1960s was driven by advertising and media hooks. Reelect the president was Nixon's reelection campaign. Notice how that implied by the use of reelect and the president. There's a lot of subliminal stuff going on there. Jimmy Carter's "Aw shucks" smile and all homespun charm won over Ronald Reagan's scripted lines, although Reagan's lines were extremely well delivered. There was the Willie Horton ad against Michael Dukakis. There was "Read My Lips, No New Taxes" by George Bush Sr. There was Bill Clinton's Kennedy-esque charisma and Wall Street friendly policies. There was the president you'd like to have a beer with. Remember George W. Bush? Sorry, I was thinking of John Wilkes Booth. And there was, of course, Obama's youthful energy and charisma. Now, it's true that Hillary Clinton lacked the charisma of her predecessors, at least in the media. She has a stronger presence in person. But as 2016 approached, she was carefully groomed in the art of the one-liner, how to deliver a debate gotcha moment, and all the other techniques that have become indispensable parts of how to sell a president for the last 50 years. And then along comes Bernie Sanders. He seemed totally unsuited to the art of presidential salesmanship, although he did have a few moves of his own. But he was the unlikeliest of challengers in both his politics, that is, Democratic Socialist, and his personal presentation. It turns out that both were instrumental in his political success, a success so profound that it nearly overturned the most carefully planned political coronation in modern history. How did he do it? It was kind of, I almost liken it to either underground theater of the 1960s or punk rock in the 1970s. And it turns out, actually, while he was mayor of Burlington, he gave punk rockers an opportunity to use a local facility to put on concerts. That's where he met his wife, Jane. But I don't say that because he was a punk rocker with spiky hair or because he was an avant-garde theater performer breaking the proscenium, as they say, and walking out into the audience, but because he broke the conventions of political communication. He was gruff. He was always saying the same thing. Although he could be very funny, he didn't tell jokes all the time. He didn't turn on the charm for reporters. In fact, I used to love it when he would scold reporters and say, "That's a stupid question." I think one of my favorite moments working for Bernie, and I had a couple, I think one of my favorite moments was when he was being interviewed by Rachel Maddow at a town hall on MSNBC, obviously, but before an audience. And Rachel had this habit of asking candidates, if you weren't a politician, what job do you think you would have? So she asked Bernie, and he said something like president of CNN, because if I ran that network, you wouldn't see the crap on there that they have now. And I can guarantee you the press room burst out in laughter. So, he would tell reporters that's a dumb question and that kind of thing. So people knew he was authentic. People knew he was real. So, and in doing that, and I'm not saying he was perfect, but in doing that, he showed the American people and the Democratic Party, those among them who were willing to listen, that the old tricks of the political trade didn't necessarily still apply in the 21st century. He broke rules that have been crafted over 50 years, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. He pointed out to me, for example, that he was raising money with fundraising letters that were 1,000 words long, even though they're not supposed to be longer than 250 words. He laughed when I told him I'd written one for him that was even longer than that when I was done. But as it turns out on that one, we were wrong. Shorter emails do raise more money, as we now know, because we're barraged with them every day. But the point is this: he was willing to push against the rules, he was willing to break them, he was on the path to becoming an uncandidate. So, in the end, all his political liabilities, his age, his accent, his socialism, his messy hair, worked in his favor. They all told voters something important. He wasn't a blow-dried politician in the imitation Kennedy mold. He was something different. He was real. So here's something I want to say about that. What all the what all the pundits, I should say, pundits, yes, politicians, yes, consultants too, what they all are still missing a lot of the time in presidencies, although they're getting smart about it. But the lesson that they didn't know until Bernie came along was that in the age of the internet, everybody is a political expert. Everybody is an insider because everybody has access to the polls. Everybody can see or hear some of the behind the scenes conversations. Everybody has seen secret tapes or photographs to tell the story behind the story, as Mitt Romney learned in 2012 when his recording condemning the 47% went public, putting down people who weren't as well off and pretty much sank his presidential chances. When everybody's an expert, when everybody knows what they're seeing in a speech or in a soundbite or in an ad or in a obviously scripted quip, the old tricks just don't work anymore. They come across as just that, old tricks. So Hillary, gotta hand it to her, even though we have different ideologies. Nobody ever worked harder, I think, to become a presidential campaigner than Hillary Clinton. But the techniques she had carefully mastered didn't help her fend off the Bernie Sanders challenge. It took her powerful connections, strong media bias, and the political calendar to save her, because the political calendar was front loaded in her favor. At times, I have to admit, watching from the viewpoint of the Sanders campaign, I saw what I thought were really dirty tricks from her campaign, but sometimes I almost felt sorry for her. She was using 20th century techniques, those techniques she had worked so hard to learn in the first real political campaign of the 21st century. I'll have to say, at least one of my instincts was right. Bernie galvanized a movement in waiting. He had sensed his presence. He had sensed its outrage and idealism. Apparently, in my writing as well, which is why he hired me. His wife, Jane, told me that he almost never hired writers because he reveres writing and considers himself a writer. And he is a writer, not in the technical sense, but he's a great one in his own way as a master of content and directness. In that sense, he taught me a lot. I'll tell you a story about an op-ed I wrote for him. He asked me to write an op-ed about drug prices and the harm they were causing and why we needed to get them under control. So I wrote what I thought was a pretty good op-ed. I think it was called "It's Time to Fight the Lobbyists." That's the headline I gave it, and get drug prices under control. And then I began by talking about the politics and economics of drug prices and what that was doing to people. In fact, I think his only real change, he changed the headline to "High Drug Prices Are Killing Americans." That in and of itself is a lesson. And then he added two opening sentences, which went like this: all across the country, Americans are finding that the price of the prescription drugs they need are soaring. Tragically, doctors are telling us that many of their patients can no longer afford their medicine. As a result, some get sicker and others die. Now, that was a brief but effective masterclass in cutting to the chase in political writing, where you have to say what you have to say in a few short sentences. And in that sense, Bernie's campaign was something of a guerrilla campaign in terms of communications. And I call it a guerrilla campaign because communications drove its fundraising, which came from the grassroots up. It wasn't a function of the software. Everybody wanted his software or email list. It was something that arose organically because his message and his communications struck people's heart, moved them into action. It was a guerrilla message because it said, we've had enough spin, enough focus group tested catchphrases, enough political gamesmanship. We're going to give you something different, the truth, end quote. Now, activists, some have gotten that lesson, but not enough since then. And at some point, we'll get to that. But Bernie's campaign told us that you can run on the issues and win. It also taught us that people are tired of the cliched political moves that are so commonplace since the Nixon-Kennedy debates. In fact, I have a theory, which I will get to in segment 2 of this talk, which is that the old structure of political communications, speechwriters, consultants, and so on, is going to need to be revolutionized going forward. So I've obviously come to the point as I conclude where I'm going to need a second one of these. But I will say this. For a while, at least, he became the de facto leader of a political uprising, even after he lost. He was not, because he was not a conventional candidate, he was not put in the conventional role of losing candidate. His point, which he knew from the beginning, was not to win, but to change the conversation. That was spectacularly successful. He became the de facto leader of a political uprising. As we'll talk about in segment 2, the Biden years made that a little more complicated. Now with his Fight Oligarchy tour, he's looking to reclaim that role. But of all the things I want to talk about in these 2 segments and focus on, it's that transformative role in politics that interests me the most. Obviously, Bernie is not going to live forever. None of us are. So what are the lessons? What are the seeds of tomorrow's movements and campaigns that we can take from that? That'll be the theme of the second segment, but I'm going to be reflecting on that. I don't want to cut that short because I spent every day of my life for, as I say, 65 weeks, watching and listening to this campaign. Every day I kept track of the larger matrix of events in which it was taking place: economic developments, foreign policy events, war, terrorism, scientific advances, all of the above. I watched this campaign unfurl inside this matrix, and I watched the media color it and change it and distort it and make it ugly. So this is a lesson that we still have not fully learned. Media bias is real and it exists. Politics is not a game. The media still treats it as a game far too often, but every vote in Congress can have life and death significance. We thought that the Democratic Party and its followers learned that with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And in a sense, maybe they did, but they also didn't. And those divisions are something we'll also talk about in segment 2. The unselling of the president is a precedent that we cannot set aside. We need to remind ourselves what happened that year. I know less about the 2020 campaign, so I'll address it in brief, but not in as much detail. For example, I'll leave you with this thought that even as Hillary was mocking Bernie's focus on economic issues, the economist Elise Gould, who would probably prefer I not bring her up in this context, was publishing findings showing that inequality had risen once again and reached record heights in 2015. So there were real things happening in the world. That campaign began to teach me and many of us how to address them. but it ended with bitterness and a concerted war against the ideals and the values and the millions of people that that campaign represented. That war, that assault is not only taking place from the right, but from the center left. It is something we need to understand and grapple with so that we learn the lessons of that campaign and also the lessons of what came after. So that's what we'll address in the second part of this conversation on what I learned from the Bernie campaign. I hope you stick around for that one next week. In the meantime, as always, thanks for listening. I appreciate you.